staff's gonna, there we go. So now we've been notified officially. COG staff's gonna take the attendance after the completion of this welcome. For any guests that join our meeting, we encourage you to use our chat feature for questions or comments that you may have during the meeting. And certainly with a great program like we've got today, I imagine you're gonna have some. So I'm gonna hand the ball off to Lucille Johnson, and she will take the minutes. Or actually, perhaps Stephanie was with us. I don't know, or who else is on?
I am going to take the minutes, Marty.
Good,
It's my
good.
pleasure. So as I call your name, if you'll just say that you're here, present, that will be helpful. And
Thank
then
you.
we'll check to make sure that we get everyone, that perhaps there may be some people that have logged in under the wrong mailer. We will check that too on that. Alexis Jackson, Ben McGill, Bruce Payne,
Here.
Brian Hayward,
Here.
Chris Kaufman, Chris Dicer, Chris Fuller,
Present.
Craig Holst, David Bristol,
Here.
David Schlegg, Diana Miller, Donna Simmons, Doug McDonald, Erica Sullivan, Fred Schmidt,
Here.
Greg Sims, Judge J.D. Clark, Dr. Quick, Janie Havel, Jeff Sanford,
Here.
Jeanette Espinosa, Jim Waymeyer, John Boswell,
Here.
John Smith, Judy McDonald, Cassandra Carroll,
Here.
Kevin Shatley, Lansing Bentley,
Here.
Clark, Leslie D'Agostino,
Here.
Lisa McMillan, Luis Tamayo, Lynn Spencer, Dr. Cosio, Marty, Marianne Moon,
Good morning, here.
Michael Grace, Nikki Hillip, Nico Reineke, Orlando Compass,
Here.
Pamela Mundo,
Here.
Phil Wagner, Ray Dunlap, Robert Stearns,
Here.
Shane Shepherd. Did I miss anyone, or if you come on, I see Erica, you're here. If I have missed you, we will try to get back around again before the meeting ends. Marty.
Mike Grace is here.
Continue.
Mike Grace.
I got you, Michael. Mhm.
Leah Clark is here too.
Okay, got you.
Donna Simmons is here too.
Gotcha.
David Schlegg, City of Dallas.
Okay, Marty, we can move forward.
Excellent.
Mhm.
Thank you, Lucille. Thanks, everyone. As we take in the attendance here today, we do have a new member among that list. You heard her note that she was present. Lansing Bentley has joined us from the city of North Lake, and is under that category. She's filling the open seat in the under 25,000 population category on the board. She was appointed in March of 2022 by the COG board. You've got her introduction in the information that was sent to you as you do. I'm not going to go over all the bios of our speakers today so we can stay on point and give them more time, but certainly Lansing, it's important to point out she's had some great awards in addition to being honored by Keep Texas Beautiful. You see that she's received accolades from the Fort Worth Mayor's Commission on the Status of Women for outstanding community work. And like many of us here, not me, but many on our group, she has a master's from the University of North Texas. So we're certainly glad to have you on, Lansing, with us. And I have a special place in my heart for North Lake because that was a community I consulted with when I was in the private sector years ago before you had an economic development program. So kudos to you and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad you're with us. Glad you're with us.
Thank you.
Let's turn to item 3, which is the approval of our minutes from our last meeting on February 7th. Hopefully you've all had a chance to review them, and wanted to see if anyone had any comments, or if I could get a motion for approval.
Marty, I'll move to accept the minutes as presented.
Thank you.
Who accepted them? I
That was
didn't-
Jeff Sanford.
Okay,
Jeff Sanford.
thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And could I get a second?
Second.
Michael Grace, thank you. All right. And I would, Lucille, I would just say we accept them by acclamation unless we need to take a voice vote. Is that okay? Since there's no, have heard no concerns. Okay,
Mhm.
good. Let's do that. I want to spend plenty of time on our guest speakers because this is a topic that I just got the privilege of speaking on with my team here at the City of Grand Prairie at UTA's Richard Cole. Yeah, there is another MPA program in this region at University of Texas at Arlington, the Richard Cole seminar that was just held this past month. And it's a very important topic. We've got 3 great people with us today from the New Growth Innovation Network. They're going to talk with us about inclusion and equity in relation to economic development and recovery, specific to, as we can begin to point it to, certainly the North Central Texas region. They're going to provide us with some data about our region and also speak about how equitable and inclusive economic development practices create a stronger region for everyone. You see them with us today. I'm going to, in a moment, hand the ball off to Amanda Straight, Jessica Gonzalez, and Sunny Malhotra. And want to remind you that their bios were sent to all the board. You can go back and look at those if you'd like. They've got some tremendous credentials. And as well, keep in mind that a copy of that presentation that I mentioned to you will be sent to all attendees after the meeting. So if you want to see the information they're going to share with us afterwards, just know you're going to receive that. And then as well, the NGIN team is going to answer questions throughout the presentation. So there's your second reminder to use the chat for questions, and COG staff's also going to be monitoring the chat. So there might, and that means Lucille will do her best as time allows to respond to them during the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the ball off. I imagine Amanda, Jessica, Sunny, welcome. And I don't know which one of you want to kick it off when I hand the ball off to you guys.
Oh, Sunny is on it. I was going to say I can go ahead and kick us off while Sunny starts to share the slides, but he's on top of things. I'm just going to do, we are going to do just brief introductions of ourselves. I think we want to talk a little bit about how we came into this journey of talking about inclusive economic development. We know that it's an important topic, that's kind of newly been a focus for a lot of communities. I myself have been in economic development for over a decade, worked for the Regional Economic Development Organization here in Phoenix, where I'm currently based. Go Suns, sorry y'all. But I've also worked for—
That's not permitted, by the way. It's not permitted. Go ahead.
Thought I'd started off light for you all.
That's not light, but go on.
Anyways, so well, hopefully it'll be a fun series for everyone.
We can promise you it will be.
I'm excited. I'm actually going to be at the game tonight, so I'll send you all some
very
photos.
Jealous. Yeah.
Anyways, so I've been in regional economic development, local economic development. I also worked in private consulting, and I think, I've seen throughout my work how much, inclusivity has really mattered. And I think particularly in the last couple of years, we've really seen that become a spotlight. And I've been very fortunate in my work and in the research kind of that I focused on to see how needed it is for economic developers across the country to get access to resources and to understand how their work, which is really important to growing communities, doesn't always do so in an inclusive and equitable way, and how we can share more resources with regions in order to start to foster that inclusion is really what NGIN is really focused on. And so this is kind of a mission that the three of us are really passionate about. And so I think we kind of want to introduce that to you all as well. With that, I'm going to throw it over to Jessica, who's going to do a brief introduction of herself as well, and then we'll get started with the presentation.
Sideway, buenas tardes, good morning, everyone. I greet you all in 3 of the languages that I know. I am Jessica Gonzalez. I identify as Taina from the island of Borinquen, popularly known as Puerto Rico. And I share that with you today because what brings me to this work is my lived experience. I have been in economic development, equally so with Amanda, for over 10 years. I started in the work supporting women, helping them into the workforce through my journey at Dress for Success in the Phoenix office, no longer at Phoenix. Amanda and I share great stories about Phoenix often. And then I also worked for the city of Phoenix, helping them with their economic development strategies, particularly with small business assistance and small business help. Helped launch a co-working center at the city of Phoenix and mobilized folks to start up businesses, and then transitioned to Local Initiative Support Corporation, popularly known as LISC, as a CDFI supporter, helping to release funding during the pandemic for those small businesses that needed the most assistance along different corridors in the city of Phoenix. So with that, I bring up a unique perspective on how to develop programs that specifically meet the needs of people of color. When I identify or use words like people of color or BIPOC, is not necessarily to say those are the only folks that needed assistance, yet utilizing those terms helps me to identify those were the most individuals that were distanced from wealth and needed assistance in those moments in time. It is a pleasure to be with you all today, and I hope that we are able to deliver the content knowledge that you seek to have. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sunny, who will introduce himself and also guide us through our agenda for today.
Perfect. Thank you, Jessica and Amanda. Hello, everyone. My name is Sunny Malhotra. I'm currently the Inclusive Economic Development Associate here at NGIN. Recently, I graduated from college and was lucky enough to join NGIN right after graduating. Prior to joining, my background has been in research in economics and political science research, and I developed a real passion for understanding and learning how institutions can really uplift those who need the most. And that brought me to NGIN. And with that, I think I'll go over to the agenda. So today we'll start off with an introduction of sort of our organization and a broad level view of that. Then we'll go into our project specifically, the Inclusive Recovery Initiative. From there, we're going to go into the 2 different projects, the technical assistance and community practice projects, and how NCT North Central Texas is the research is going so far. After that, we're going to go into our 5 calls of action, something that NGIN has developed from its founding. And then after that, we're going to go into some of the resources and tools that we have provided for everyone today. With that, I'll go and hand it back to Jessica Gonzalez.
Great. So New Growth Innovation Network for short. We've heard of variation ways of how to pronounce our acronym. NGIN is the easiest way that we've identified to identify us. So if that works for y'all, we'll continue to use that throughout this presentation. We're proud to say that we were founded with a set of economic development practitioners who have decades of experience in economic development. And in the birth of NGIN, roughly around 2018, 2019, those economic development practitioners came together to identify that as economic development continued to conduct its process, conduct its work, there has been continuous efforts to make sure that whatever has been done is equally beneficial to everyone in the community. And time over time, they identified that that was not the case. And so those individuals convened, initially started with the convening of 40 economic development practitioners, coming around at the table. This is pre-pandemic when we came around the table together, 40 people deep, and identify what is the best strategy. How do we bring forward a way to help move economic development practitioners to identify more inclusive ways to meet the needs of individuals in the community? And when we think about this work, we focus on economic development, but we also identify that there is this level of intersection with community development and other factors like capital, et cetera, that is needed and needed to be discussed in that moment. And so with that, where NGIN is today, we now have an executive director, Yasmina McCarty, who has spearheaded us to develop an innovation hub. And so such as where we are today, we've started this work with a community of practice. We've activated a variety of community of practices. This particular one is one of our first. In order to bring practitioners together and learn more inclusive practices and methods to embed equity into their work. Our work is regional. We have tested out a few methodologies of how to work within regions to help them identify what is most in need. And we're grateful to say that we have the 6 technical assistance regions that we're working with now to help them think about that work a little bit closely. And so Amanda's doing a great job on that front. And we hope that today some of that work can be realized in the preliminary space that we're in at this moment. With that, next slide. And so for grounding in this presentation, in the start of the pandemic, NGIN identified 5 calls to action, 5 areas where we have acknowledged that where to move the needle when it comes to driving inclusive economic development. And so with that, you'll see on the screen these 5 points. We also want to recognize that, yes, these are 5 specific points, yet they can be uniquely identified and uniquely applied based on region. So they are not meant to be prescriptive or to say, these are the things that you do X, Y, and Z, but yet these are the focus areas, and then mold it within your regions based on what is impacted. And so we want to uplift these at the forefront. We do have a source, and with Amanda's released presentation, you'll be able to link with some of these sources so you can see these 5 actions in more depth. So next slide. And so the Inclusive Recovery Initiative. The Inclusive Recovery Initiative is the project that we are working with your organization on to help drive inclusive growth. This project is funded by the US EDA. We are the first community of practices launched with the EDA to help embed inclusive economic development. This is pre-ARPA funding, so we're grateful to be able to spearhead this effort. And then 3 areas of focus that we're identifying are: how do we create a shared understanding of what inclusive growth is and how do you embed that? And to make your regions most competitive, not only competitive in the market, but also competitive in regards to uplifting all people in your community. We also identify that top of mind, COVID-19 continues to impact a lot of communities. And so making sure that we are embedding resilient efforts to help your economic development strategies maintain themselves through the pandemic and also post-pandemic once we get to that point. And lastly, we also recognize that the CEDS is the guiding light, is the guiding document for many of your regions. And as it lives, it is a document that helps guide a variety of different places. And so we identified, how do we help support the EDDs to look at your CEDS and embed some of these inclusive areas into your goals and strategies. We believe when you create a document that says it at the upfront, this is what we believe in, these are the areas that we think are most impactful to move our economy forward with an inclusive lens, that will help to identify more solutions at the local level. And so with that, that is an overview of our project. Next slide, please. And so as I mentioned, the community of practice is currently maintained home environment. The community of practice currently houses 94 practitioners across 29 states and 52 organizations. And so with that, we have convened 2 convenings with a total of 6 throughout this community and throughout this process. These convenings are designed with expert speakers to help connect some of these strategies, connect some of these concepts into the learning. We also develop peer-to-peer sessions so we can gather feedback and from the practitioners and allow practitioners to connect with one another. We ourselves have provided ourselves for NGIN direct support. So whenever we come across concepts that may be a little bit more difficult to land, we lend ourselves for support. And lastly, I like to say that we have custom built a community network where practitioners can dive in, have access to a resource library, all of the content can be being shared. So this is an opportunity if there are an interest to have access to some of our recordings. You can contact your EDD to have access to some of those learnings as well. We have no issues with sharing that content. As well as connect with other regions. This is a place that will allow folks to connect with each other, et cetera. And so we wanted to create a safe space where that organic learning can happen. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Amanda, who will talk more about the technical assistance package.
So as Jessica mentioned, there are two key components of this project. And the reason it's kind of divided this way is we value this community of practice model where we can share broad learnings, expand a network, allow EDDs across the country to connect with each other, all around the topic of inclusive growth. But we also, through this project, want to provide some hands-on assistance. And the great way to go about doing that also allows us to kind of find some common themes, some key takeaways, some best practices that we can then bring back to the broader group. And so through that, we're very excited to be able to offer this kind of technical assistance package to a few select, very special economic development districts across the country, one of which is NCTEDD. So we actually picked one from each EDA region across the country. So they're all very different. We have one in North Central Washington, Mid-America Regional Council, which is the Kansas City region. We have one in rural Minnesota, Springfield, Massachusetts, and then Columbus, Georgia are the other regions that were selected along with NCTEDD. And it's been very exciting to work with these regions. We're still somewhat in the early stages, but really excited as we wrap up this first phase of analysis to really start to understand more about what regions we're struggling with when it comes to inequality. So the first phase, like this kind of slide says, is really analytics. So some deep data dives on kind of not only the economic impact of, or not only what are existing economic inequalities within the region, but how regions can start to think about presenting this data to really understand the nuances of economic inequality. Some of this data is going to discuss some of the particular economic impact of COVID. Unfortunately, as with all data we've seen, post-COVID, it is challenging to get some of that data, and some of that data is not as good as we would like it to be, just because of survey challenges and that sort of thing. So some data will just be a static picture in time and hopefully encapsulate kind of what has happened post-COVID. But some of it will be just really looking at what are the inequalities within the region. And we've allowed regions to kind of look at this in a number of different ways. So there is what we call the baseline analytics, which is what I'll be sharing with you today. A picture of it, just a portion of it, which is really just understanding the existing conditions, like I said, how have demographics shifted, and what does income look like for different populations and different communities within the region. For NCTEDD, we will also be doing some particular data around small business with that kind of as much of a nuance on kind of what happened during COVID as possible. Because we know that that was a real kind of challenge during COVID was how small businesses, in particular, BIPOC-owned businesses within regions were impacted. And so then, as we wrap up that phase, we'll move into a planning phase, which is really taking that analytics and that data and forming, I call it an inclusive economic development plan. It's not a full plan. It's something that can be really embedded in the CEDS, but it is really just using this data to identify some key themes, some key actions, some key recommendations that really could take place to kind of move the needle on some of those critical issues that we identify through the analysis phase. And then the really exciting piece of this is that we actually have some funding for implementation of a program of capacity building, of program design, something that we'll get to brainstorm over the next few months to come up with what that looks like, whether it's training or like I said, an actual project of some sort. But we're really excited to kind of not only just leave it at this is what you should do, but also take it to this kind of how do you do it, and start to think about how we could execute upon something. So we're really excited about that. Just so you know, this project goes through early next year, or through March next year. So we're about a year into the project now, and we're really excited as we kind of continue in this project. So with that, next slide, we'll share some kind of preliminary data that we've done. So we partnered for this data, we partnered with Fourth Economy, who you may have heard of. They are a kind of economics and analytics firm. And I've worked with economic development districts across the country. So they helped us with some of this data, some of it NGIN pulled on its own as well. But I think this chart is pretty self-explanatory. And I think we see pie charts that look like this and a lot of SEDs that we see across the country. And while I think it paints a real detailed picture of the demographics of NCTEDD, one thing I just kind of want to highlight is this is a very static picture, right? And it also there's a more nuance, I think, to race and ethnicity and how people identify than can always be captured in just a standalone pie chart. And so what you'll see is while we present this data and we understand and we can talk about how the Hispanic and Latino population has grown and how it makes up, you're starting to become a majority minority community, which is not a phrase that we kind of use as much as we would like, because we try to get it away from using the term minority. But what I want to kind of think about is how we've seen across the country that the population that identifies as two or more races has grown. And so when you start to kind of put people into like a little bit of a pie chart, you're not getting some of the nuances of race and ethnicity in the community as you might like to think. Also, this standalone chart doesn't capture the changes over time, which is what I'll get to in the next slide here in a second. And then it also doesn't capture, what the economic reality is for different groups within the region. So that's what the kind of data that we're hoping to kind of add to the conversation when we look at what we present on SEDS when it comes to demographic information in the region.
You know what the name sliver is there at the top, the lighter purple one?
And that should be just other.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's not labeled. That's a great question. I'll make sure it gets labeled at some point. But yeah, that would be other race, which is also, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another conversation that we like to talk about when we picture and divide people into groups like this. Is there is an other category, but what all does that include is a really nuanced conversation as well.
Good question, Bruce.
Yeah. Any other questions on this? Go ahead to the next slide, Sunny. So as I mentioned, that's a snapshot in time, but we really do want to think about how do demographics within the region evolve, correct? So as I said, the region's becoming more, less white alone, and more diverse. So we see that while all demographic groups have grown, white alone, non-Hispanic has grown at the slowest rate, while Hispanic or Latino has grown at the kind of quickest rate. We also, within the nuances of census too, I want to point out, we use these definitions as they do. One that's not on here that we also often talk about is American Indian or Alaska Native, which is how census defines it, but is also probably not how a lot of Indigenous people would identify themselves as. And so you have to think about the nuances of that when you're presenting this data as well. And we usually recommend kind of providing some notes about kind of the language of how people identify. And I'm sure Jessica can speak on that a lot as well. But So within this chart, you can see, as I mentioned, that the Hispanic and Latino population has grown much quicker than the white alone non-Hispanic population. In 2010, the one point I'll pull out from this text is that in 2010, 51 out of 100 residents were white alone non-Hispanic, but now 57 out of every 100 residents identify as non-white or Hispanic. So we've seen that kind of population grow.
This is,
And next,
this is, what area does this cover right here? Is this just our area or the state or what?
this is the NCTEDD region, so the
Perfect.
16 county region, correct? Yes, thanks for
Perfect.
asking.
Absolutely.
And that question leads to why this chart is really hard to read. So I'm going to walk you through it. But with 16 counties, there's a lot of data to present here. But hopefully, I did it in a way that's really understanding. Is somewhat easy to understand once I explain what this kind of chart is depicting. So median household income, we really kind of have to present at a county level just because it's hard to aggregate that across a kind of given region. But we wanted to kind of capture the nuances of different household incomes across the region, but also by race and ethnicity, which I think this is a critical thing that we want to talk about when we are talking about inequality within a region. So this chart, the solid black line that is vertical is going to be the median for all race, all ethnicities in the county. And then the different colored lines are going to be for different demographic groups. So you can see that in almost all of the regions, in particular, Hispanic, Latino, and Black or African American households have lower median household incomes than all households or white households. And white households have higher median household incomes in nearly all of them. There are a few counties for which data isn't available, unfortunately, but I think this chart, if you really dig into it, really kind of paints that picture that we're discussing about how income looks across the region, and in particular for certain demographic groups. Any questions? Does this make sense? No.
This is Luis Tamayo. I do have a quick question. I'm looking at, for example, Parker and Kaufman. Am I reading it right that the Asian median income is higher in those communities than the white alone, or really any other? Same thing with Ellis.
Yeah, that is correct. So in quite a few of the counties, we see that Asian households have a higher median household income, and that's not uncommon across the U.S. It's a trend that we do see.
Okay, so the first line of text there, white households have a higher median household income than all households in 14 of 16.
Yeah, so all
correct?
households meaning the black line, not any individual.
Oh, then
yeah.
the median of all households.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? I know this is kind of a complicated chart. I'm
Also,
well.
Amanda, sorry if I.
Yeah.
I also want to mention that for Asian households, because it's such a large demographic group, there's massive inequality within the Asian group as well as there is for a lot of other demographics. So nationally, we see that there's a lot of research to suggest that within the Asian demographic, there's actually like a huge, if you break that up, there can be incomes that are much higher than the average and much lower than the average.
Thanks for mentioning that, Sunny. That's such a great comment to address, because I think that is true even within incomes, but it's something I didn't mention even within demographics is that understanding that, not all Hispanic Latino households are the same, understanding what kind of backgrounds and, countries, your population really is representing is there's much more nuance than just Asian households or Hispanic or Latino households or even Native American indigenous households, and understanding those nuances within a region is really critical. And thanks for adding that, Sunny. Next slide. So within that, I also wanted to talk specifically about employment and wages. This is by race and ethnicity. there's a kind of note note on this that we don't have kind of white alone non-Hispanic here, so you won't see kind of the sum total on some of these columns, but we've seen actually that over the last 5 years there has been a growth in wages, even more so for some of those populations that have historically seen lower wages. So the wages for Black or African American alone have actually grown quicker than those for white alone. The Hispanic Latino wages have grown quicker as well. However, if you really look and dig into these numbers, you'll notice that wages still remain significantly lower than those for the white alone population. And that gap, while it's closing, there's a lot of data that talks about how long it would actually take for it to close completely. So as economic developers, one thing I think about is the nuances of what type of jobs, what type of industries we're supporting within our region, and how those industries specifically support BIPOC individuals within the community, and ensuring that there's economic mobility within those industries in order to continue to see this wage growth kind of increase even more drastically for some of these populations that have historically seen lower wages across the gamut. This chart, and it also shows kind of the total number of employment and how that's increased across different demographics. I have another chart actually that's also really interesting that talks about labor force participation. And if I remember correctly, what's really interesting or kind of nuanced, I guess, when you think about employment within industry or employment within the region, is that you'll see that usually Black or African American communities or people have a higher labor force participation rate, but also higher unemployment. And so what you're seeing there is really, this challenge where Black or African American, they are more likely to be in the workforce. They need a job in order to gain income. They're less likely to have, single income households where there are two people living there. So their labor force employment or their labor force participation is higher, yet they also suffer from higher unemployment rate, which is a real challenge. Next slide.
Amanda?
Yeah.
I have a question that I'm not sure if you would like to answer this now. It says from your data,
Absolutely.
What are you showing is the reason for the lower wages?
Yeah, so obviously we can't necessarily pinpoint an exact reason for the lower wages. Most typically, yes, I was gonna say there are a handful of things. We do have data on education and kind of the different levels of education. Obviously these communities, we do see within Black communities and Latino communities a lower level of education. We also see, here's another point I was going to make, and then I forgot as soon as I looked at the chat. I apologize. Yeah, we do have data on that, which I can actually add into this slide before we send it out on kind of the difference between education and wages. My other point was a lot of it also is dependent on type of industries that these people tend to work in. It's kind of stereotypical, but you see that often minority populations tend to work in types of jobs that don't have that economic mobility that I was mentioning earlier. And so that's some data that we don't have right now, but I'm hoping to get at some point, which really looks at across industries what the racial breakdown is, so that you can really kind of understand, like, within retail or food service industries that employ a larger population of BIPOC individuals, those wages are naturally lower in those industries. And so that's often why you see across the board that the wages for those populations will be lower. I don't quite have that data yet, but I'm hopeful that we'll get it and be able to kind of paint that nuanced picture of employment within the region as well. Does that help answer your question? Yeah, okay. Next slide. So, oh no.
I think
Sunny?
Sunny lost connection.
Okay, hold on. I can open and share. The next slide is related to home ownership. And obviously this isn't kind of a traditional economic development topic. Yeah, he just said his Wi-Fi went out. So it's not a traditional economic development topic, but as Jessica mentioned earlier, we really think about economic development and the intersection with community development and understand, as we call it, some of the barriers to access jobs. So, okay, hold on. Can you see this?
Yep.
Okay. So we recognize that there are certain things that have historically prevented certain populations from accessing jobs and also building wealth. And home ownership is probably the number one issue in that regard for how certain populations have not had the ability to build wealth within their communities. And that's primarily because they've been deprived of the opportunity to own their own homes and finance that. So we see that within this region, that within compared to white communities, Hispanic, Latino, Black communities have a much lower rate of home ownership. And that's typical across the US, but I think is something that when we think about economic development and how we can, in the what I call the supportive services toolbox, which we'll talk about in a little bit, how we can partner with organizations that are focused on home ownership to ensure that doesn't become an ongoing barrier to generating wealth for BIPOC people within your community. Lastly, this is just kind of a little bit more nuanced. Yeah.
Amanda, don't mean to interrupt. If you can go back.
No.
This is a pretty hot topic right now across the nation. Obviously, the younger generations are primarily of a minority background with higher birth rates, immigration, what have you. Typically, younger generations are the first-time home buyers out there that are buying entry-level homes, either starter homes or homes in the exurbs. However, I think David might be on the call right now, but an article came out about the city of Dallas looking into institutional buyers of starter homes for just to buy them and put them up for rent. Right now, Wall Street has discovered single-family homes as an area for investment and asset control and actually trade for profit. And so I think that's something I'm not sure, Amanda, if your group is aware of or on top of, but that's a percolating issue. The House has met at the federal level numerous times on this particular issue. Dallas has brought it up about looking into legislation, which I'm not sure if could ever happen. But again, that's just the home ownership equation is an issue right now, especially with the investment community gobbling up most first-time home buyer eligible homes.
Yeah, no, I totally, NGIN isn't too big in the housing conversation, but it's kind of a kind of pet interest of mine, I will say. So I kind of talk way too much about the nuances of housing and how it kind of strains many communities. And obviously I live in Phoenix, where we have some of the same issues. Recently our housing prices, inflation adjusted, got back to where they were, pre-Great Recession, which isn't, good for us since we had one of the biggest kind of housing busts. But that is a challenge, and there's nuance to the housing conversation, because I think that there's two ways that you want to think about wealth generation and race and home ownership. And one is that helping BIPOC people own their own homes is really important. But also, sometimes renting is okay. I'm a lifelong renter. I'm always going to rent. But understanding that there needs to be tools to help those people who rent also build their own wealth is also really critical too. So I think there's a lot of nuance within that conversation about how we think about it. Sometimes it's good to increase rental properties and the number of rental units in communities where there weren't previously rental units, because those neighborhoods often are excluded. They exclude people who can't afford to build a home. So sometimes that can be good, but there definitely is a real challenge, right? When you see people deprived of being able to kind of go into a community and own their own home. So there's a lot of nuance to that conversation. I appreciate you bringing that up. And I don't know how much NGIN will continue to kind of delve into this topic, but I think it's a real critical one when we think about how our communities grow.
Amanda, I will say
Yeah.
too, on the single family side of this, I like to comment that the most expensive thing that we can say yes to in the field is single family houses, because they don't pay for themselves. They chew up enormous amounts of land. But they're extraordinarily good for wealth generation for the owner if they have that, you know. But an apartment building, which takes up far less land, can house far more people if they had another way of building their wealth, which requires probably some sophistication in, you know, the market. Where do you put your money? That sort of thing. But that's a big ED thing. I hear people all the time say they want single family houses. I'm like, well, you're just ultimately raising the tax rate with more of that stuff that comes, because you have to serve it with police and fire and water and sewer and roadway and everything that cities do, parks, etc. But the return is not there as they are for larger buildings or multifamily buildings.
Yeah, and that's a very, you know, nuanced municipal finance conversation to have. But, you know, there's no doubt in my mind, at least, that we have underbuilt rental housing in the US for a long time. And I think that you see that with just the increased rental prices across the board. And I think that'll become a more nuanced conversation as well, is kind of understanding that, you know, yeah, there are multiple ways of kind of thinking through the housing conversation. It definitely is nuanced and complicated. But I do think that I think there's no doubt that the way we've done kind of thought about homeownership and housing in the US has incredibly contributed to vast disparities across race. And so I think the more nuanced we can start to think about those conversations, the better. And yeah, Pamela, your point is spot on. Design and diversity of housing, you know, absolutely. I think, you know, not everyone can afford a single family house.
Yeah.
And so, and you know, never will be, and might not want to. And so kind of thinking about how you can create more diverse neighborhoods is critical. I see a hand raised. Chris, if you want to.
Yep, I would like to know if this graph, if you have an older one, and what's the change? Has anything changed in the last 10 years? Has it gotten better or worse for different groups that are underrepresented?
I do not have that, but we can certainly pull it.
I think that would be very helpful to see if we're getting worse or better in distribution of home ownership. There's been a lot of effort made to help these underrepresented groups achieve financing and get them landed. And I'd like to see if there's any success that can be mirrored through a similar report.
Yeah, and this data is 2019 ACS data, so it is pre-COVID. We technically do have 2020 ACS data. We haven't been using it for all of our metrics just because it's a little and so we can't really, and we also couldn't really compare 2019 to 2020, but we can take a look and see what data we do have that we can compare. across the way. So David, to your question, I would be in the renter units. I'm a lifelong renter, so always.
Yeah, my point to that, Amanda, would be
Yeah.
the data is I'm assuming you wouldn't be alone. So there's others out there. So we're fixing a problem that isn't necessarily a problem per se. So what I'm looking at is where's the data of people like you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The people who just prefer to rent. You're absolutely right. There is a degree of that. I think when we paint this picture of home ownership, what we're really talking about, or what we're really trying to get at, is the ability that these communities have to build their own wealth within their homes, right? So there are certainly people who just decide that's not the route to go. But I would argue that there are a significant number of people who would want to buy a home if they could, and then are deprived of kind of that ability to generate wealth. And we have a lot of data too on that's not here, and I can see if we can pull that too. That maybe you're right, might tell that story a little better when it comes to just the gaps in wealth versus income. So I think Sunny, I'm gonna pull a number and tell me if I'm completely wrong. But I think there's data that shows really across the US that Black households, a lot of Black households really have close to zero really wealth. And that's drastically different than white households. And that is primarily because they're less likely to own their own home. I apologize, I have a leaf blower in the background making a lot of noise.
The commonly used statistic is that for every $1 of wealth, so homeownership is one of the largest contributors of wealth in the United States, basically what people own, and for every $1 of wealth of that a white household has, a Black household has 5 cents. So looking at while home ownership, you're paying like a mortgage towards your own wealth, renting is paying money to someone else's wealth.
Thanks for that, Sunny. Good comment. So get rid of my leaf blower. I think there's yeah. I see one more question, and then I think we'll move on to kind of wrap up the data, and then Jessica has some additional slides about kind of what all this, kind of what.
Amanda, it looks like David Smeg in Dallas has his hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that, yes, the city of Dallas is looking at this housing challenge. South of the Trinity in particular, there's this economy of investing in communities, looking at home ownership, but also gentrification is a challenge. And as was mentioned, the corporate component of buying single family housing is hitting Dallas significantly. I just had dinner this weekend with a friend who sells real estate, and sometimes she can't beat the corporates. They'll come in and upbid by $50,000 to $100,000 some homes. One of the things we've looked at, and Louise at Dallas County is aware of this when he was with the city, is we've looked at the TOD areas. We have TOD tips, looking at rentals near proximity of light rail. And that might be one of the components, because as you know, transportation costs for people on lower incomes who are also renting, if you can take that cost away from the transportation component and put that money towards either savings that otherwise would go to gasoline in a car, is an option if you were to rent, or if you could have a buying component near a light rail station with a mortgage, a condo, if you will, some type of small townhome or something, where that equity that would be spent for transportation could go towards a mortgage, is something that we've looked at. It continues to be a challenge. There's a lot of components to it. And I do believe our lobbyist that represents us in Austin is working with our housing department to address some of the concerns recently that have been occurring regarding home ownership and speculation. I do think the interest rate rise is slowing the market up and we'll see where things go. And as you've shared, some of the data is a bit old, so it's going to be interesting to see where the post-COVID world is, but it isn't looking good from what we hear from the marketplace. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for this information.
No, thanks for sharing that, David. I think you made a lot of points. Gentrification is an ongoing challenge, and I think one thing we talk about a lot is really the process of engaging in communities as development happens, and is always critical. And I do think that your point kind of echoes back to the conversation about understanding that there are multiple ways for communities or for people to build wealth. And understanding that potentially there are ways outside of home ownership to do that is critical as well. With that, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and move on. So the last kind of picture I just kind of wanted to present to you, and we have some more data on a geographic scale, but I wanted to add this just because we've been talking a lot about race and ethnicity and economic disparities within that, but we also know that there are geographic disparities as well. And that there's, rural poverty within regions too. And so understanding how that impacts your economic development challenges is really unique. A lot of communities that are, primarily white, reach out to us and kind of are interested in what the inclusive economic development conversation is in a rural community. That might not be as diverse. And we understand that there are unique economic development challenges within those regions that, as Jessica mentioned earlier, we focus on kind of race as the primary component of disparities within wealth, but understanding that as you tackle some of those challenges, you can kind of take a broader view of how your economic development work is affecting a broader population of people. So I'll summarize and just kind of talking about what our next steps are. So, I outlined as we talk about this is very high level key findings, but we do see, discrepancies in employment, income, and home ownership. They exist across race, ethnicity, and geography, and you're going to see that in all regions. But as we dig into what the nuances of this conversation are and what the critical challenges are is going to be ongoing. And next, like I mentioned, we'll add some additional data focused on small businesses, particularly BIPOC-owned small business. We've seen that as a critical issue during COVID that came about as far as how BIPOC-owned businesses and women-owned businesses were able to access some of the funding mechanisms versus others. And so that nuance of kind of supporting those businesses within a region is some additional data analysis we're still doing. And after that, we'll kind of move into that findings, recommendations, planning stages. And it's really just identifying some actions that can move the needle. What are the critical things that the region is thinking about where we can lend that kind of beginning stage implementation support and what that programming might look like. So that's kind of our next steps over the next 6 to 9 months. I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica. Happy to answer any additional questions on that, maybe at the end, just so that we have enough time for Jessica to go through her slides.
Yeah, and I think we're all active on chat too, so that could be also a place for continued conversation. So great, thank you, Amanda. That was rich, and we're grateful that we were able to answer some questions. We'll also leave, we have our emails listed at the end of the presentation if you want to ask more direct questions to either of us. So with that, I'm going to be moving on to thinking about language and thinking about how we just presented deep and rich context through this data. And Amanda touched upon labeling, and how do we identify people, and how do we ground ourselves to make sure that we're not leaving anyone out. And so through this project, we identified that in order for us to start convening with practitioners and helping them through the journey of identifying how to embed inclusive growth and in economic development, we thought it would be important to release what we're calling the Communication Resource Guide for Inclusive Economic Development. This guide was first initially presented in our first convening with a collaborative presentation with Partnership for Southern Equity, who is based out of Atlanta, Georgia. Their work has been deeply entrenched in community engagement, community advisement, and centering community wealth. Their main focus is uplifting and supporting the community wealth building for Black African American members in their community, yet they've also extended their learning across the US as well in a variety of different projects and other spaces, including community development efforts and climate justice. This project was funded by the Cerna Foundation, so not using the EDA funding, yet we thought it'd be important to share with the practitioners in this community of practice. And so what we did first is we thought it'd be important to define what inclusive economic development is across also the many other names it has lived under: economic inclusion, equitable growth, etc. And so in this guide, which will be released in the next few weeks, these terms will be defined, and it creates a shared space, a shared language on what we're talking about when we're talking about inclusive activity that helps to meet the needs of people. We also thought it would be important to launch this guide because we do recognize that terms are institutionally defined and may need to be taken out of context when thinking about equitable engagement. Now, what does that mean? Many of you rely on very specific funding sources, such as the EDA or other federal grant funding. They may have terms defined in their way, in their language. Of course, when applying for those types of funding, you'll adapt to that environment and adapt using the terms that they do. What we present this communication resource guide for the purposes of how you communicate with your community. And why that's important is because in many cases, your community may be thinking about inclusion in a very different way. When they see themselves or when they read documents coming from your organizations, your municipalities, et cetera, they may not necessarily identify themselves or see what you may be referencing, such as using the term indigenous. Indigenous is wide ranging. Indigenous is inclusive of Latinos. I myself can be identified as Latino. It identifies Native American. You may not know that until you talk to me. And so there may be other individuals in the community in the same context. The same thing can go for members of the Black community. Not necessarily everyone in the Black community may identify as African American, but some may do. And so really being specific about how you use terms, specifically when you're presenting data, give context, right? We do understand that most of this data is coming from the census. And so there are specific ways that individuals have to be identified, but it's also okay to give context through footnotes or other identifying ways, or even in presentations such as Amanda did today. And so we wanted to make sure that we grounded everyone in regards to what we mean when we talk about communication, so that we were being mindful in setting the footprint or the foundation. And so with that, next slide. And so when driving inclusive economic development, there is process and then there's action. The process is the CEDS, right? There's a specific way that you have identified in the next 5 years. There is a way that there's a pathway, there's a guiding light. These are the areas that we've identified through analysis of data, engaging community, and talking to leadership of what we need to change the tides in our community to make sure that things such as affordable housing, accessible to a job that allows you to mobilize and not just stay stagnant, so you don't see generational wealth in your community, et cetera. And so when we think about action, we're thinking about what are the core principles in setting your strategies that lead to action and in an equitable way. And so when we say this, we're designing strategies, policies, and programs with an equity lens that identifies who is most impacted. And so with that, we're saying the most impacted are those who you have identified are not moving the needle. And so although Amanda presented data that showed there are folks that may have seen wealth increase, there's still a level of time that's needed for them to actually actualize that wealth and see it within the family, because there's also other factors in what they own. Such as one gentleman stated that let's rethink about how we think about our TOD strategies, maybe lessening that cost of transportation, et cetera. So finding those points and thinking about it more strategically and comprehensively. Another thing that I noticed is, maybe there's a need to develop a new corporation board. We've seen this done effectively, and we'll be doing a presentation coming up with Tulsa, who has actually combined their community and economic development efforts into one economic development corporation in order to center equity and make sure that they are aligning their efforts in equitable facet. And so there are communities out there that are thinking about this strategically and combining their resources so that all of the strategic efforts across transportation, housing, et cetera, are living under one roof. So that way they're not missing anyone in their actions. Next slide, please. We also think about these concepts in regards to language in thinking about things with an asset base. We couple this with the data, because sometimes when we see data, we can tend to lean to the negative, and we start to paint certain communities in this deficit language. And so a lot of times we hear from communities, well, if we identify that X community is not the largest percentage of our community, and so what is the return on investment if we were to strictly focus on that one community? And so that language actually does not include equity, because we're starting to see people as dollar signs and not necessarily as assets. And so in reality, we at NGIN celebrate culture, and within that self, the community members, once we start to paint community members in a way that they are actually adding contributions to our community, such as when we identify a specific neighborhood and see that there's an opportunity to do revitalization, there's a reason why that community is seen in positive light. There could be identified culture in a community, richness in what they bring to that area, such as their grocery stores, their foods, the activities that they offer in that community. And so we start to celebrate that through murals and uplifting the uniqueness of that. And that in itself is an asset. In the way that they do business is different, et cetera. So we acknowledge that although certain community members may not have access to wealth, we also acknowledge that poverty isn't monolithic, just such as race isn't monolithic. And so it's experienced differently across different ethnic groups. So that means that the strategies and the way we communicate those strategies need to be comprehensive in that as well. And I stated in the chat, I haven't been watching the chat during my presentation, but I stated in the chat how important it is to think about primary research and think about, okay, well, we have the secondary research. It's opening up opportunities of what else is needed. And sometimes that what else is needed actually requires more intentional community engagement and stakeholders that can give you those opportunities and shed open, or maybe it's not shed open, but open up the dialogue to find deeper opportunities. And so with that, next slide. And lastly, we've stated this, and I've stated this throughout the presentation, is bridging wealth gaps is a critical component of this work. And in order for us to see the true economic growth and the resiliency that we need across economic downturns, disasters, et cetera, we need to acknowledge that the most impacted are those that have been distanced from wealth continuously. This concept of generational poverty is real. And so individuals are experiencing this, whether these are new immigrants who are coming to the community for whatever reason to America for that idea of realizing themselves and finding opportunity. But adding context of wealth generationism and who is most excluded and actualizing wealth in their lifetime is something that should be identified versus seeing folks in this way of return on investment. And so with that, next slide. And so lastly, within this guide, we not only have a glossary of terms, which is pretty rich. It not only provides definitions, it also in some cases provides supportive data to build further context of those terms. We also have provided writing tips on how to best use that term in an equitable way. We close the guide with Partnership for Southern Equity's 6 principles of economic inclusion, which are listed in the guide, and then 3 guiding frameworks using those 6 principles. And so we divide equitable power, equitable economy, and equitable support. And within those, their principles are listed. So in this guide, we also are connecting to resources outside of the guide from other practitioners in the field that have exercised these 3 frameworks. And we'll start to build upon these frameworks and start to think about more deeply about what are good examples that your regions can take, learning from the field. This work is ever evolving and it's continuous. And so we hope as NGIN to continue to house that information and give it back. So folks not only are thinking about these in concept, but also saying, all right, Jessica, how do I actually do this work? Like, what is an example? And so within this guide, and we worked with Partnership for Southern Equity to identify some of those resources so that way you can reflect back on and learn from other communities. And so there's no questions. I'm going to pass it back to Amanda.
Lucille, how much time do we have left? Do you want me to speed?
We will end at 11:30, and so it's 12 after 11 now.
Yeah.
I think Marty, there was a comment that you had from one of your folks at Grand Prairie that I thought was really significant.
Thanks, Lucille. Yeah, I invited my staff to join in, and I guess one of them was in. I think it may be Kay Brown Patrick. I'm not sure, but we feel like it's important to also bring up financial education when we're talking about generational wealth in underrepresented communities. And so I just passed along that comment, thinking that might be something to toss out there too.
No, I saw that, and I think it is a great comment. And I want to loop it back to another comment I saw in the chat as I was going back through once I was done, and we kind of had a long conversation about home ownership versus renting. And one thing I do want to emphasize, and I apologize if my kind of conversation around this didn't want to come across. I by no means think that home ownership is the entire answer, but I think it is really interesting and important to understand the nuances of different demographics having different levels of home ownership, not only because of the wealth gap, but also that means that people who rent are also much more susceptible to increases in rent as well, in rent growth. And so as you look at kind of that conversation, I think somebody pointed out, promoting the construction of more apartment homes is really critical in order to mitigate growth in rent, which, as you can tell from that picture, is going to impact BIPOC households more significantly. So I think that there is nuance in that conversation, but that is a point I wanted to make sure to address. So I'm gonna fly through these last few slides. I just want to kind of share our toolkit as we view it for inclusive economic development. And I kind of alluded to this a little bit, but we kind of wanted to paint this picture of I guess, the ways in which we think economic developers can address equity within their communities. And so the first one is really, how do you make the tools that you're already doing more equitable? How are you looking at your incentive programs to ensure that companies are investing in the community when they are getting incentives? How are you looking at clusters that are supportive of economic mobility for BIPOC individuals? How are you supporting small businesses, across the spectrum? And how are you investing in communities from an infrastructure, from a workforce standpoint, from that small business standpoint, across the gamut in an equitable way? But like I said, we also understand that there are additional barriers to equity that are barriers to job access that aren't necessarily always within that economic development wheelhouse. And those go back to the conversations around housing, transportation access, childcare, how your neighborhoods are designed, climate justice and sustainable development. And all of those issues are economic development adjacent, but really important when we talk about addressing equity. But the last bucket is maybe the more important and most important, and that's really how we change our systems in order to build equity into what we do. Fundamentally, it's about community engagement, but also stakeholder engagement, ensuring that you have the right voices at the table when you're making decisions, making sure our organizations are diverse and representative of multiple voices. How are you measuring your outcomes and ensuring that they are not having disparate impacts on different communities, and building that local capacity within communities to address some of these issues. I have a case study here, which is actually about housing. So I wanted to pull out, I have actually had a handful of these, but we whittled it down to just this kind of one plan that really was looking at how a region, Atlanta in particularly, could address affordable housing. And I think you should all go and look at this because it really is, digs into that conversation we really were having about the nuances of ownership and renting. Because this goal is really looking at rental housing in particular with that kind of knowledge of how it is impacting the Black community more significantly as the Black community is more likely to rent within the region. And so they've kind of created a consortium of community developers and economic developers to help address this issue. And I think it's kind of an interesting case study to look at. We also have a handful of other resources that we've linked in this presentation. Sunny, if you have that link, feel free to drop it in the chat. That has a link to this document that's up on our website, so you can take a look at it and click the links, but you'll also eventually get the PowerPoint. More resources still to come. Obviously these aren't all filled in, but we continue to dig into more resources. If you have them, share them. We really are a resource hub. That's how we identify ourselves. And we are just trying to kind of spread the knowledge that we come across as much as we can. So with that, if there are any more questions, we're happy to answer them. Otherwise, we appreciate all of your time.
Yeah, that was a sip from a fire hydrant, as I heard it said. Lots of data, can't wait to get what y'all promised us to send out to everyone so we can all digest it. A lot to take in one time, but all excellent information. I know a lot of people have brought on questions. Anything that needs to be brought up urgently before we deal with our other business from anyone on the board?
And Marty, I just want to thank Amanda, Jessica, and Sunny also for coming on and speaking with you guys today. We are very fortunate to have them partnering with us to look at this whole notion of equity and inclusion in underserved and unserved areas, and to be able to go back and include some of that information into our SEDS as we update it, going forward. So thank you guys so much for what you guys are doing. We, as Amanda said early on, we were one of 6 COGs across the country, or 6 economic development districts across the country that were selected to participate in this program. And so we're fortunate, and we find value in this process. So as more information comes forward, we will be bringing that to this body for your direction on how we will go as we look at updating the goals in the SEDS, updating the SEDS, and just trying to make our region well-equipped from an economic development standpoint. So thank you, guys.
Yes. Sincere thanks. Great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you again for having us. We appreciate it.
All right. So we've got a little bit of time left. We'll go on to the rest of our business that we have here today. In terms of new business, we do have a comprehensive economic development strategy update, and I would imagine that may be coming from you, Lucille.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Over the last year, actually, we would have updated this comprehensive economic development strategy in 2021. And then the pandemic hit in 2020, and it slowed all of that work down. And then as we began to work on it, then we came out, EDA came out with the CARES Act, and then we later came out with the ARPA funds, programs, and then we were inundated as a district with helping our region to apply for funding under the CARES Act program. And we were very fortunate to get 8 projects funded in this region through the CARES Act. And then there are a couple of projects that have been funded under ARPA. So with that, it kind of put us behind, we think, with regard to working on the SEDS, but we had as a part of our ability with funding that we received under the CARES Act for the district to offer support and so forth, and to bring people like PRIT on board to help us with economic development work. We also built into that the ability to work on the SEDS and do the update of the SEDS. So we were able to extend out the SEDS through this year, through June of this year. I'm happy to report, based on all of the work and so forth that you guys did over a period of months last year to work on the SWOT analysis, that has been very fruitful for us. The SEDS draft was put together. We, put it out for public comment. We put it out for priorities on what our industries and things should look like. And finally, I think we had 6 different opportunities for people to come in for public hearings to make comment on the SEDS. So finally, we were able to put all of the information together, take it before the NetCog Executive Board. It was approved by the board unanimously. And so we have forwarded that document on to Economic Development Administration for their final comments. And once we get that back, we will have a new comprehensive economic development strategy sitting out there for all the region to be able to take advantage of. So I want to thank you guys for the work that you all really committed to. If you may not know, but over the period of time with us dividing everybody up into separate little areas to work on the SWOT analysis, we had some 22 meetings to go over the materials that were part of the SWOT analysis. So thank you guys for your commitment and your stick to it-ness to get this piece done. So we're just waiting now to hear back from EDA with regard to the final confirmation of the SEDS, and then that'll be posted out there. Now, with the work that we're getting from NGIN, we will come back to you guys with, okay, what do we need to do to make some improvements, some updates, some changes, look at our goals, look at what we've done to make sure that we are being inclusive with this document. And we can always update this document every year, even though we have to do a full update on it every 5 years, we're still able to update it every year. So at any point when, as we're getting information and learning new things, if you all want to revisit the SEDS to make sure that we have done our due diligence to make sure that we are being inclusive in this region, we want to do so. So with that, Marty, that's, and Marty, one other thing, I do want to thank Prit and Connor for their work on the development of this new document that we're presenting and have sent forward for approval through EDA. They have done quite a robust amount of work to get us to where we are with this document. So I do want to thank them for their work.
Yes. Well, and back at you, to you, Lucille, too, as someone who's worked with both of our historic SEDS to create the first one so we could become a district, and then now to carry forward. I know you've marshaled so much work and kept us on task. So thank you, you and your team, for how well you've done with keeping us on track and on time as we needed to with the EDA. So kudos to you. We have a virtual meeting. In terms of new business, the only thing we really need to talk about is we have do have a virtual meeting coming up on Monday, August the 1st at 10 a.m. I understand, you, as a reminder, Prit sent out a calendar invite for the meeting to all the board members. So if it's not on your calendar already, double check that, make sure that it is, so you can be with us. And then certainly we'll, that may serve as a great time when we've received all this data from NGIN to be able to do what Lucille just mentioned, as Michael Grace has just pointed out to everyone too. We can use this as information to massage and correct and amend as we need to ensure the inclusivity and diversity is woven throughout, if not targeted as it needs to be in any portion of our SEDS. So that'll give us that opportunity. So without any further business, I know this isn't specific to this information, but I always appreciate city managers who are supportive of economic development. Lucille made me aware a little bit ago, and I had not heard that a tremendous supporter of economic development passed this past Friday, and I wasn't aware, Bob Hart. That's sad news. I'm sorry to have to pass that along if you haven't heard that. If you're like me and didn't know, a tremendous man who I had served with on UTA's Kappa advisory board with. Hate to hear that, and I don't know the circumstances, but that's sad news. If we don't have any other business, we'll be adjourned for today, and we thank again everyone with NGIN for the work you've done. I thank all of the board members for your persistence and your commitment to North Central Texas, as well as to your individual communities, your institutions. Hope you have a blessed day.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you, members of the board, and thank you, NGIN, for being on with us today. And I'll see you guys a little later this afternoon, NGIN, for our conversation this afternoon. So thank you guys so much. Everybody have a great week. If you all need something, let us know. And Cassandra, if you'll send the minutes when you get a chance to sign them, we certainly would appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Lucille.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.